Hello everyone and welcome to Religion Reconsidered. My name is Jack Vernon and today on the show we're going to be talking with someone who has been called one of the toughest men on the planet and one of the deadliest men in Coventry. Geoff Thompson is famous in the world of self-defense. After reaching high ranks in numerous martial arts disciplines, Geoff became a nightclub bouncer in Coventry in the UK, at a time when the city was considered the most violent in Europe. And from his experience there, went on to develop a form of martial arts based on real-world situations that centered on the idea of efficacy, or to put it another way, hitting first. From this, he became one of the world's leading self-defense experts and got to a point where he was teaching Chuck Norris's students in the US. But beyond that, Geoff's life has been one of facing fear. At the age of 11, he was sexually abused by a teacher, and as a result, he suffered severe bouts of depression throughout his youth, and fear took over his life so much so that he became, in his words, scared to live. If it's not clear already, Geoff's story is multi-layered, and so I do suggest getting a bit of background on him before listening to this episode. In the episode description, I've posted 2 YouTube links. The first gives you a taste of Geoff's view on martial arts and his teaching technique. The second is a link to a TED talk delivered by Geoff where he focuses on the story of him being sexually abused, facing his fears and finding freedom. Once you're on YouTube, you'll see that there are further videos and interviews with Geoff, which I'd encourage you to peruse at your own leisure. The reason for getting this background is because in this conversation we will be focusing on Geoff's spiritual story, and while the various threads of his life are all intimately intertwined and we will be discussing them, the broader context will give Geoff's words more meaning. So in this rather esoteric conversation, Geoff discusses how he used methods from his martial arts training to develop himself spiritually and overcome the darkness within him. While beginning with spiritual martial arts teachers such as Gichin, Funakosi and Morihei Ueshiba, Geoff's spiritual knowledge has come from places as diverse as George Gurdjieff, the Armenian-born mystic, the Srimad Bhagavatam, one of the great Hindu Puranas, Roman Catholicism and Rumi. As you'll come to hear in our conversation, Geoff considers his time as a nightclub bouncer as being a true metaphysical experience. Geoff is now a multi-award-winning author of over 80 books and has also written movies and plays with titles such as Watch My Back, The Beginner's Guide to Darkness, and The Divine CEO. And while I can't say I've read or watched all of his works, I would say I recommend the ones that I have seen. As always, if you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to like and subscribe and share it with your friends and family. We do have more content on our Instagram page, so feel free to head over there. And if you'd like to get in touch, my email is jack@religionreconsidered.com. And so thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the podcast.
Geoff Thompson, thank you very much for joining us on the show, on the podcast. You are very well known in certain circles and becoming more well known in others. And you've sort of become famous for your work with martial arts, and you're now a very well published author. And in a lot of the interviews that you've done, you sort of focus on that personal development and the martial arts aspect and really taking self-mastery of yourself. But I wanted today in our conversation to focus a little bit more on your religious or spiritual journey and that development. So I thought we might just try and sort of start from the beginning and do it in a bit of a narrative sense. But I wanted to ask about your religious background when you were growing up.
I was brought up Roman Catholic. So that's my genesis, Christ, the church, all of that. I didn't fully understand it, but it was pretty deeply ingrained. I had a sense of God. I was always even as a young guy, though, I'd be in church looking around thinking, no one's living this. I know that. It was not like a judgment. It was more of a confusion. And I think I know all these people and they're turning up, but it doesn't feel like they're living this. I wasn't living it myself. I was just a kid, really. But I did have a deep sense of prayer. And even as a kid, I used to pray quite religiously. I would do lots of prayers and I didn't want to miss prayers. I didn't fully understand the nature of prayer at the time, about the rhythm of prayer, about the nature of prayer as a divine antibody, if you like, a way of building consciousness, but also a way of dissolving anti-consciousness, just with the sounds, with the spirit within the words and the rhythm of the words. the song of the words, you know. I didn't understand that, but I understood. I felt a need to do it, you know. So, but I lost contact with that quite early on. You know, I suffered quite a lot with depression. I was, as you probably know, I was abused when I was a kid. So that set me off track a little bit. I started in the martial arts, was abused by a martial arts teacher. That frightened me, properly frightened me. You know, I couldn't trust anybody. I still trained, but I was very careful about where I trained and who I trained with and who I put myself under as a student. And if teachers got too close, I became very frightened of that. So I still carried on, but it was, you know, I was negotiating the martial arts world. And it was only much later when I, you know, I kind of suffered with a lot of depressions and felt that depression was an enemy. You know, it would turn up like a demon and boot down my door and literally take over my life. And then one day, I've said this story a lot, but I think it bears repeating. I just had I would call it a theological infusion, a theological grace. And I just felt this rush of righteous anger, going from being afraid to leave the house and being afraid to be away from my wife, you know, following around like a puppy because I was so afraid. And afraid of, you know, like Mesner when he was climbing Nanga Parbat, Reynold Mesner, this guy that's made of granite. He says he's on Nanga Parbat and he said, I'm too afraid to go further up. I'm stuck on the mountain. The wind is trying to whip me off the edge. He said, I'm too afraid to go up and I'm too afraid to go down, but I'm too afraid to stay where I am. He said, at this moment in time, he said, I'm crying because I don't want to be away from my wife. And he said, and I'm afraid of life. I'm afraid to be alive. That summed up where I felt when I was depressed. When I read that from Reynold Mesner in a book called Solo, Nanga Parbat, when he climbed Nanga Parbat solo, I remember thinking, what a brave guy, because you look him online, Jack, you see images of him, or if you watch him interviewed, he looks like he's actually just stepped out of the rock. He looks like he's made of rock. You know, he's a man that looks like, he's a man that you know has faced adversity. So he says, I remember this story when he says, I just thought, I've got to get up and I've got to move and I've got to hit the top of the mountain. This was his second ascent. So he said, I got up and he said, I actually threw the tent away so that I couldn't stay. I couldn't tent. I had to go up. He said, I just walked and walked. And then I realized, he said, I was walking down, not up. He said, I couldn't do it. So it was his third attempt before he did it. So I had that sense of being afraid of life. But when I had this theological infusion, this supernatural infusion of courage, I just felt I'm not living like this anymore. I was so angry. I can't live like this anymore. I'm not prepared to let this feeling batter me and determine my life. I've got a wife, I've got children, I have got a life to live. And I just had this, the moment I felt this infusion of courage, the second grace was I just had this whole complete idea about building a fear pyramid. Again, I've told this story a lot, but every time I tell it, I don't mind telling it again, because every time I tell it, I learn something more from it. And hopefully of the people who've heard it before will learn something more as well. But I had this complete idea to build a fear pyramid and write all of my fears down, all of the things that were battering me. Least fear on the bottom step of the pyramid and worst fear on the top step, and then systematically confront those fears one by one, with the idea of becoming desensitized to the feelings of adrenaline, to the feelings of fear. And it was obviously it was the beginning of my new life, really. It was like a rebirth, because I suddenly had hope and I suddenly had a modality. I'm going to confront everything I'm afraid of. I've not read this anywhere. It wasn't something I'd read. Every book I read was disappointing to me, because they all promised to give me the secret to overcome my fears, and none of them were. And they all, the same as me, they all saw fear as an enemy. They all saw fear as a three-dimensional demon, you know, and it was the harbinger of doom. But when I got this theological infusion, And I wouldn't have known it as that at the time. It's only years of study that have helped me to understand that. I certainly had this modality and had this hope. And suddenly my life expanded and I started to confront all of the things I was afraid of. Now, I thought I was overcoming fears, which of course you are. But what I was actually doing was converting fears. I thought I was facing an enemy. I wasn't facing an opposing force. I was facing a complementary force. And the complementary force was chasing me until, I was afraid of it. But when I turned around and said, like, what are you running for? We need to get together. So, of course, the pyramid is like this. And that's what it showed me. It showed me this trinity, this negative terminal of energy, positive terminal of energy, and using the will force as the bridge or the isthmus between the two. So when you've got those two opposing forces, they're battling with each other and they're mortal enemies. But when you bring them together and unite them, they create a field of light beyond the Trinity. This is what Rumi says. There is a field beyond right action and wrong action. I will meet you there. It's very esoteric, but that's what it's saying. So I was building a pyramid. So I didn't realize that every fear I overcame, although they were all on a pyramid, I was actually using the pyramid to overcome them. So I had a fear of spiders. I had a desire to overcome the fear. I used my will force, my causal body, to sit between the two and convert that latent energy into light. I guess Jung would call it individuation. So the shadow disappears when it's individuated. The shadow is no longer a shadow. The demon is no longer a demon. The Satan is no longer a Satan when it's individuated. But of course, when it rises up, you have to have tremendous control of your central nervous system and of your will force more than anything. You have to be able to sit as the isthmus. Not that you create an isthmus, Jack, that you are an isthmus. The isthmus is the barrier between these two realities. So it divides them, but also connects them. So I had to sit in there. So I had to find this, if I've got a fear of spiders, find the fear, sit in the suffering. The suffering was still there, but now there was a purpose behind the suffering. I knew what the suffering was. Oh, I've got to go into this feeling and I've got to sit there until I'm no longer afraid. Initially, it was just like, I'll confront this 10 times until I'm not afraid of it. What I was actually doing was I was actually deliberately suffering, to paraphrase Gurdjieff. I was deliberately suffering. So it was conscious labor. I was consciously finding things that I was afraid of, and then I was deliberately suffering. And the suffering had a purpose, because the suffering was like bringing these two forces together with a third neutral force to create light. That's what religion is for me. Religion is about alignment, means to realign. Religare comes from the word religare, to realign, man to his source, man to his potential. So this was me realigning. So while I was in that isthmus, there was no longer a dark energy. There was no longer a light energy, a good energy. It was just light. So all of the forces were equilateral. So at any point of the triangle, they were equal forces. They were neither good or bad. They just created light. And of course, the moment you start to create light, people notice. You are noticed. And people want to come to you for instruction, even if they don't fully understand what it is you've got, even if you don't fully understand it. I mean, it was probably 35, 40 years ago, and I'm still, that concept nucleus that I was given is still unfolding. I'm telling you things today that I didn't know before I sat and spoke to you today. Just little details that are coming to me. So that led me to this fear pyramid and overcoming my fears and transforming my life, because suddenly I wouldn't let my wife bully me anymore. The job I was in couldn't contain me, because I only stayed there because I was afraid of it. And I was working it wasn't a terrible job. It facilitated me, but it was working shifts and it was terrible hours, and it was just, your normal job where where you're terrified of, you'd hate the job, but you're terrified of losing it. You don't want to go there, but you're afraid of not having it. And every time there's a wage rise due, it's the same old process as we due a wage rise. So about 2 months before we go in for the wage rise, the management start rumours of redundancies. So everyone's like, oh, we better not ask for too much. We should be grateful for a job, all that stuff, you know. So
yeah, the classic methodology of the labour force. Yeah.
Yes. So I started to overcome these fears, and I was literally converting the darker energy into consciousness. That's a very popular word at the moment. I'm aware of that. But when I say consciousness, I mean, I was just able to see more. I was able to understand more. So suddenly I'd be reading Sun Tzu and I'd understand it. Not understand it as a book of war, but as the lesser jihad, but understand it as the greater jihad, as the inner war. Not officers against the rank, but, you know, the intellect and the mind controlling and informing the causal body, and the causal body, you know, controlling, you know, all of the kind of elementals within the body, all of the different factions, you know, this sense of building an army, building a unified or unitotal force inside. So the unity of being, they would probably call it in esoteric practice. So I started to read things on an esoteric level. So it was no longer a binary book, good, bad, right, wrong, you know, dark and light. It was a quantum book. It was going in and it was recognizing me as an individual soul. Oh, Geoff Thompson's here. He's expanded consciousness. So we can give him something esoteric. So we can go from the literary deeper and deeper into the subtle, depending on how far he wants to go. But this is where he is now. This is what he can do. This is where he's going. This is his potential. This is how much he's prepared to be uncomfortable and suffer. And it starts to give you esoteric secrets. And they're there just for you. I've never read anybody anywhere in the world writing about what I discovered from Sun Tzu. Now, that's not bragging. That's just saying that what I learned from Sun Tzu, from the Art of War, was what was meant for me to learn. It wasn't what somebody else had said, and then I put my spin on it. It was for what I was to. It was what was given to me. My whole life, or all of my lives, would have orchestrated to a point where what I was informed by within that book would have not really been understood by anybody else. I just read it as though I was literal. Like it was so. I was looking at it, I was saying to people, oh, it means this, and they were going, does it? I've never heard of that, but it seems so obvious to me.
Yeah, but in that sort of a sense, it's more than an interpretation. It's a personal connection to the meaning behind it, or within it.
It's a grace again, Jack. They call it a theological infusion or a supernatural infusion. So if you imagine the binary is like I said, it's a literal reading, and the quantum is a subtle reading or an esoteric reading, and the level of subtle information you get is determined by your ability to be able to receive it, and your ability to be able to receive it is determined by your willingness to be uncomfortable or to suffer, but to suffer with a reason. If I go into the gym and do weights, I know that going into the burn quickly and staying in the burn long is what's going to develop a physique. And it's not difficult. It's painful, but it's not difficult. But not many people do it because they spend 3 hours avoiding the burn. Whereas the good guy will go in and spend probably maybe 25 minutes in the burn, and he develops an amazing physique. And he's not training as much as the other guys, but he's training because he understands the burn. He actually learns to love the burn. So esoterically, it's the same. We've got to learn to recognize that fire, that suffering, is where the candle wax melts and vaporizes and becomes the food for consciousness, if that makes sense. So I didn't understand that at the time. I just understood that when I confronted this thing, if I confronted it enough times, I had no fear of it at all. And then suddenly my life expanded. I was able to see more. I was better informed. I got a stronger modality. I got faith because it worked. So I was able to go to the second fear. And I was able to start laughing about the fear. You know, I'd go to the dentist. I hadn't been for years and years. I had a terror of dentists. So that was second on the list. And the woman at the dentist said, fill this form in. And on it, he said, how long has it been since you've been to the dentist? And I said, I just wrote down, oh, ages. And he asked me what I did for a living. And I said, I'm a buccaneer. And I just had a real laugh with it. And I stayed with that dentist for 30 years. Because I could hear her laughing at my responses, but I was in there in the middle of my terror laughing, and the laughing really diminished it. And I had one visit to the dentist, and the fear of dentists dissipated. That three-dimensional monster became a two-dimensional cartoon and literally dissipated. And when it dissipated, the nature of the fear was liberated. I'm paraphrasing the Srimad Bhagavatam, the from the Vedas. And the effulgence that was in it came across to me, and I expanded. So there's lots of parables and metaphors and similes for this in all of the Bibles, but you wouldn't read them really on the revealed Bible. You wouldn't read on the literal Bible. You'd only read it if you start going into the subtle realms. And that to me seems as though it's an invitation, but you can make yourself busy. Or Richard Rose would call it a happy accident. But you can make yourself accident prone. You can get yourself busy practicing habitual virtues in order to attract this theological virtue. So if the more I'm working, the busier I am trying to live a clean life and trying to live a kind life, the more you automatically become noticed by higher forces that will be compelled to come and help you. And they'll want to come and help you because obviously their development is determined by how they help people lower down the ladder develop. And your development is determined by how you help people down the ladder. That's what was it Richard Rose said, you've got to work on 3 rungs of the ladder. Always one rung above and always one rung below. So you take instruction 1 level above, you give instruction 1 level below. You don't go 2 levels up because you won't understand a word of it. And you don't go 2 levels down because they'll try and kill you. Because they'll be actually absolutely angry at that, that just the suggestion. You don't have to do much to anger these people. Just wear a set of rosary beads and they go into a frenzy because they don't understand the power of the concentration you can develop through working the beads. It's one of the greatest esoteric secrets. Someone said to Al Qushari, he was a Sufi saint, what do you still carry? How come you still carry beads? He goes, well, beads is what got me here, so why would I not continue to work with them? I love that.
Some of the fears that you're mentioning, and I don't mean to belittle them at all, but they're quite sort of stereotypical and very, a fear of spiders, fear of the dentist. They are sort of those comical fears that that people are made fun of. But I know sort of the big fear that you were really facing was fear of physical violence.
Well, let's just say, Jack, that those were entry-level fears.
Yeah.
They were like placeholders. They were like the house ghosts.
Yeah. And so did you feel in facing those that you were sort of working your way up to?
Yeah, I had to. That was my white belt stuff. I had to. But what I recognized is that when I overcame those fears, there were deeper fears below them. I thought I was afraid of spiders, but actually I was afraid of everything. That was just the manifestation it took. And I had so little control over my causal will that if I saw a spider in the corner of the room, I'd allow it to determine the fact, I'd allow it to stop me from sleeping and I wouldn't pick it out. And I kind of almost celebrated it. Oh, look, I'm afraid of spiders. Or with the dentist, I never admitted I was afraid of the dentist. My biggest fear was a fear as a man of admitting that I was afraid. So I had to overcome the fear of fear. So it became very subtle. I was afraid of, leaving my job, because it was secure and I didn't understand what I would do outside of that. But really, I was afraid of my wife. But actually, I wasn't really afraid of my wife. I was afraid of my mum, even as a grown man. So these are the things that started to come up. Now, I could never have admitted that. I was used to just say anything for a quiet life. Well, I've got to keep my mum quiet, but I was actually afraid of them. You know, I was very afraid of them because I'd been brought up around very dominant female characters, and of course, the female character represents that a part of our dualistic reality, where the if we're not careful, the feminine side of our being can take over and can become selfish and greedy. They call it the side of us that receives in order to just for themselves. You know, it's a way of basically receiving spirit and killing it. It's a selfishness. It's a greed. So I needed those entry-level fears in order to access the other ones. So I needed to look at the placeholders. I needed to look at the emojis and go beyond the emojis and see what the source was. So that was the whole idea of it, really. As I started to go up the pyramid, other fears started to, I would overcome those fears, and they were, as you said, they're mundane, they're comical, but they were these little tiddlers were determining my life. They were stopping me from living. If I can't overcome a fear of spiders, I'm going to really struggle, I'm going to really struggle to overcome a fear of violence. If I'm struggling with the mundane, I'm not going to be able to play with the magical, am I? So this was all about taking me from where I was, which was at the very base level, and then overcoming those fears, and then going, yeah, I'm actually afraid of my mum. I'm afraid of my wife. I need to stand up for myself. I'm afraid to leave work. I said to my wife, if it wasn't for you, I would not be in this job. I wouldn't be here. And she said, stop blaming me for something that you're afraid to do. You want to leave that job, you leave it. You're afraid to leave that job, and you're blaming me. So I started to realize I wanted to be successful and to live my life around being successful, but I didn't even know what that meant. I had no idea what that meant. And the fear pyramid asked me, it was a living entity. It was an egregore. It was sentient. It was saying to me, well, what is success to you? What does it mean to you? It was saying determined success. Just to me, success was, as working class kids with not much education, we would be, our fantasy was to win the pool or to win the lottery. Our fantasy was to write a hit song, even though we weren't musicians, and live off it for the rest of our life. Our fantasy was the stuff we saw in the papers about somebody that had some weird anomalous idea and made a fortune from it. That was all we knew about success. That's what we aimed for. We didn't understand the mechanics of it. But the egregore of my fear pyramid would say to me, well, what does success mean to you? I want you to understand. I want you to go into the minutiae. Tell me what it is. Show me the workings out. So I went from being somebody that didn't even understand what success was. And of course, that's why I was afraid of it, because I had no working plan and nobody around me to show a working plan. I spoke to this rough sleeper once. I sat in a cafe having some breakfast with a rough sleeper. This is an example. And I said to him, what is it you really want to do? And he said, I want to go into big business. I just want to do big business. I said, yeah, what for? He said, I want to really help people like me on the street. I said, that's really good. That's laudable. But when you say big business, what do you mean? He said, I don't know, just big business. I said, but what would you do in that big business? What would be the nature of it? He goes, I don't really know. Just the idea of big business. And I said, well, what do you love? So these were the questions I was asking him. He couldn't start. There was no way he could even begin, because he didn't know what he most wanted to do. He didn't understand what it was. But I could, if I was working with him, I could get him to go to a library. I could find out what he was really interested in. I could get him to go to a library. I could get him to study. I could get him to expand. I could get him into a job and then build up from there. I remember talking to a kid in McDonald's. It was the son of one of my students, and he was kind of from a very lower working class background, but had shown signs of intellect. And of course, he was fascinating everybody around him, because he was saying a few things. There are billions and billions of diamonds on satellites in space. What did they call it? I think satellites in space, and he was talking about you could mine those. Imagine how much money you got. He said, I'm going to find a cure for cancer. That's what I'm going to do. And he was talking about these impossible things, and he sounded really intelligent. I said, that's really good. I said, but why don't you find some way of facilitating your education and facilitating your growth at the beginning now, so that you can lead up to those kind of things? Because at the moment, you can't qualify what you're saying. And he said, there's no jobs about. Listen, he wants to go and mine, things in orbit for diamonds, and he wants to find a cure for cancer. And you can see the possibility of that, but you can't see the possibility that there are jobs about, even though there are. There are no jobs about for kids my age. And I said, look around you. I said, this shop is full of kids your age working, and they're building themselves up. I said, that girl over there, pointed to the manager. I said, when she came in here, she was cleaning floors. And I used to speak to her, and she was afraid of working behind the counter, afraid of it. Can't work behind the counter. Somebody might shout at me. I might get told off. Now she's got, I think, 3 houses, and she's managing a store, and she's this solid, determined person. Said, that's, build yourself up gradually. You're not just going to fly into space. You need to facilitate that. So start off by looking at the possible around you, looking at the necessary and the possible around you, and build from there. And eventually that's what he did. He got a job, and he started to build up to that. So though all of those big things are possible, but we've got to build up to them. So for me, I start with the things that I know. I know I'm afraid of spiders. That's what it says. Just start with the necessary, and then the possible, and then all of the possible, all of it. And then when you've got all of the possible, the supernatural, the impossible will start to happen all by itself. But start with the possible. Start where you are. So these were the things I was afraid of. I removed that fear. Another one takes its place. And I thought, oh, you've been hiding behind that fear. And man, well, it was like dropping a bomb in a Sunday kitchen. You know what I mean? It was like the effect it had on my life. Everybody was rattled, because I suddenly understood what I was going to do. I was going to give up the shift work. I was going to become a builder. And eventually I was going to build myself up to, teaching one-on-ones, just one-on-ones, £10 an hour. I could make a living off that. But, I tried that twice before. I nearly had a nervous breakdown because I didn't understand it. And the people around me didn't understand it. They literally would like, I don't understand. How will you make a living? Well, if people don't pay. And I said, well, I'm going into something I don't know. And it's uncomfortable, but that's how I'm going to learn. But twice I tried it. And twice I literally nearly had a breakdown because psychologically I had cognitive dissonance. I didn't understand what that meant to not do a job, to not go to work, to be running down the street at 6 a.m, and that's your job, to teach people martial arts, and that's your job. I had no idea. So I was building up step by step. So as I started to climb the pyramid, I found myself not even really associating it, but giving up my job. Took a job as a builder, hardy work. I at the age of, mid-20s, I was hard carrying on a building site. And they put me into college, and I learned to be a bricklayer, and I learned to trade in my mid-20s and became a bricklayer. So I was giving up conventional work. I got into a trade. I was working for myself. And then as my life was expanding, I reached the top of my pyramid, where I still had this fear of violent confrontation. So that's when I took the job as a nightclub bouncer, to overcome my ultimate fear, which I thought was my ultimate fear, which was the fear of violent confrontation. But it wasn't actually the ultimate fear. I wasn't really afraid of violence. I was just afraid of the feelings of adrenaline, because they didn't understand it, the endocrine system. So going onto a nightclub door was the greatest metaphysical experience of my life, and it was metaphysical. I didn't realize till many years later, but I created a manufactured environment in order for me, like a manufactured bespoke environment or classroom in order for me to learn metaphysics. There was an egregore around the door, again, a spirit, said, this is Geoff, this is where he is. This is what he believes. This is what he's done so far. This is how far we can take him. So I started to be given very harsh lessons on reality, on what worked, on efficacy, martial efficacy. I'd gone in there quietly knowing that the stuff I'd learned, even as a second dan, wouldn't work. I knew it wouldn't work, not in the way it was taught. It was just a big lie. But who's going to say that? Who's going to tell their teachers it's a big lie when you idolize them? The door goes, you've got to forget about that. You've got to kill your teachers. You've got to kill your parents. You've got to kill all your family. You've got to kill all of those opinions. If you want to learn here, you've got to completely forget about that and listen to me, and I'll show you what works. And you're going, it shows me what works, and you're going, it can't be that simple. It can't be that simple. And it was that simple. And I started to teach it, and people were going, wow, this is truth. This is like a shitty little nightclub in Coventry. Well, it wasn't really. Well, it was. It was a rough nightclub, but it was probably the best classroom in the world. So I'm being disingenuous, because it was a beautiful classroom, but it was a very, very rough nightclub. So this truth, this single truth, was so potent that it spread right across the world. And suddenly it was, people were looking at it in Australia and America, and Chuck Norris heard about it and looked at my videos and invited me to come and teach it to 500 of his top students in America. But that's because it contained truth. There only needs to be a mustard seed of truth, and it will be felt everywhere. So you go onto the door, you're in the same place. I want to go on the door, but I'm quietly terrified of it. I place my will force between the two and create a triangle, and I create knowledge from that. So again, it was constantly about suffering, and constantly not just about developing an isthmus now and again. I'm going to do something, so I'll create this pyramid and create something from it. This was about being an isthmus all the time. In that job, you can't have a day off. If you have a day off, you might die. You know, people died in those jobs. It was a hugely violent environment. But if there wasn't a genuine fear of being overwhelmed by these forces, you would not learn from them. Until you're naked, until you're in front of these forces and you know you might die, you're not going to let go of everything that's not real. The only way you let go of the falsity and the unrealness is when you put yourself in a situation where the situation won't tolerate it. So you stand on a nightclub door, and all of that nonsense I'd learned in martial arts just fell away like an old coat. It was like rats running from a sinking ship, because it just would not sit in that situation, and I had to find something that did. And I did. I found efficacy, and I sat on efficacy, and I developed efficacy, and I taught efficacy, and I worked it on the doors. So worked it to such a degree that it although all the situations were dangerous, it became too dangerous for me to do it, because I was knocking people over like skittles, and I was knocking them out, and I was creating, not only damaging people, but also creating a lot of bad karma for myself, and attracting a lot of negative forces to me as well. So what became a quest to overcome the fear.
And sorry, Geoff, just before you go, I think, like, just to make sure that clear to the listeners, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're talking about there with efficacy is your approach, where it's very much about not taking people down, but diffusing situations by doing what works on a nightclub door.
Well, let's sit right on the burn of it, Jack. Efficacy for me was about knowing what works, knowing what physical techniques work in a real fight outside the chip shop on a Friday night. That's what efficacy is.
Yeah.
If I haven't got efficacy, I haven't got truth. It doesn't mean I need to stay there, but I need to know it. Otherwise, I'm constantly propagating something that's not real, which is what a lot of the martial arts were doing at the time. They were all teaching block and counter, trap and counter. They were teaching intricacies where none of that was going to work in a volatile situation, where people didn't,
receiving a bit of flack for that at the time.
Yeah, loads and loads. I got loads of criticism. I got lots of hate mail. I also got a massive amount of support, and I got noticed in the hierarchy. So senior people that I'd always dreamed of meeting, my own heroes, were suddenly inviting me for tea, or I'll suddenly be in my front room with legends like Dave Hazard, or going for tea with Terry O'Neill, or Dennis Martin, and people that I'd really idolized, people that I'd really looked up to, were suddenly noticing me, and because they weren't noticing me, they was noticing truth. So efficacy was important for me because I wanted to know it worked. So if I got into a situation, I could defend myself. And I think the reason I was constantly in an ambiguous state was because I was being taught an ambiguous art, but an ambiguous art that you were forced not to question. If you questioned it, you might get battered in the gym. It's enough that it works there. Don't ask any more questions. The masters taught this. Don't ask any more questions. It's impertinent. You go on the door and it's not like that. It's like I said, it's not binary, it's quantum. And it's saying, we're going to show you the truth, but we're going to go beyond that as well. We're going to go beyond the truth of martial efficacy. Because you get to martial efficacy, you're knocking people out every night. And suddenly this voice says, do you want to know more? Do you want to understand more? Yeah. And it put me into situations where I was forced to know more. So it's kind of saying, well, where are these monsters coming from? Are you the only person in Coventry that everybody wants to batter? You've been in hundreds of fights, thousands of violent situations. That's you. So where are they coming from? Who's creating that? So I started to realize that I was, because of my false perceptions and my damaged cognitions and my damaged, abandonment schemas and this distrust for people, I was creating monsters unconsciously, and then being shocked at the amount of monsters there were about, and then developing an arsenal to combat the very monsters I'd created and forgotten. So it's saying to me, why don't you, instead of creating arsenal to defeat the monsters, why don't you stop creating monsters? Why don't you take that, you've made a monster out of clay. Why don't you break it down into a clay ball and make something beautiful from it? That's basically alchemy. So that's what I started to do. I started to use the same process, but reverse. So instead of having a friend and an enemy and a war, I started to bring the two together to find a unitotal being within me. I don't have to change the world. I don't have to take on the shadow of the world. It's none of my business. My business is going inside and taking on my own shadow, not as an enemy, even though I may have to corner it because it's been semi-autonomous for so long, but I've got to just win back all those territories and become unified and then create something beautiful in the world. And the beauty that I'm asked to create is what we're doing now. Just tell other people what you've learned. Tell other people the truth. Don't worry about fear or favor. Just tell people the truth. Not that you know everything, but just tell them what you've experienced so far. Tell them what you're certain about. And they will hear that certainty in your voice. So going on the door, I had no choice. I'm either going to learn, or I'm going to die, or I'm going to step away. And the first night I did the door, I decided to step away because it was just too much. I was overwhelmed by the amount of energy coming at me. But it was also intoxicating and seductive and beautiful. It was like Sodom and Gomorrah and Pompeii brothel all thrown into one, It was completely intoxicating. And I really did. It was the longest night in the world. It felt like I was there forever. I just wanted to get home because it was just, you were on the cusp of threat all the time. And at the end of the night, the head doorman, John Anderson, said to me, you're a bit green. You're a bit of a greenhorn, but you did well. You didn't run away and you stepped up and, you've got something raw and we can work with that. If you want to stay, you can stay. And I was so inspired by that one compliment from this guy. This John Anderson was a bit like Mesner. He looked like he was made of granite, and he smiled twice a year. He got a very small vocabulary. And he told people how much he loved them by putting them in a headlock. He was that kind of guy. I loved him. It was a great teacher. So I stayed, and then I was there for years and years and years. And at one point, I was working 6 nights a week. I was more there than I wasn't there. and I was writing about it and teaching it. And of course, the moment you start to write about it or talk about it or teach it, you're starting to understand things that you're starting to, you don't really know what you know until you pass it on to other people, if you know what I mean. I articulate it to other people. And I say, this is the minutiae, this is the exegesis. You become an exegete, you break it all down. But you keep reminding people, this is complicated, but don't forget, preemption is preemption. That's all it is. You know, the preemptive attack was basically what efficacy was. Just hit first and hit hard. You know, I've written 50 books, but I can give it you in one line. Learn to hit fucking hard. That's it. It might seem peripheral from what I'm doing spiritually. It might seem peripheral, but it's not. You know, because the preemption I learned in martial arts in on the door was the same techniques you would use if you're going to defend yourself against, you know, these very powerful dark forces, you know, like in demonology, for instance, which would represent the dark force. You got the light force and the dark force, and you have to marry the two. But the first lesson from the Desert Fathers in combating demons or these dark thoughts or these dark elements is proto-passion. What does proto-passion mean? Preemption. It means the moment there's a provocation, the moment there's a suggestion of negativity, the moment a whisper comes into your mind, the moment a deceit comes into your mind, boom, you dash it against the rocks. So what I learned on the door, I love this. What I learned on the door in a nightclub, on a nightclub door, because I'm aware that when I say it's metaphysical, people are like, yeah, oh, metaphysical, the nightclub door. But what I learned on the nightclub door was the same as what some of these desert fathers learned, you know, these monastics learned, living in caves and going face to face with that dark element, that dark energy, and recognizing the same. But you have to create a trinity with a neutral force, two opposing energies or two complementary energies with a neutralizing force in order to convert all that energy. You need all of it. It's not like you're trying to get rid of evil. It's not, obviously the moment we demonize it, the moment we give it a name and a face and make it grotesque, we go, let's push away from that. Let's run away from that. But this is saying, no, if you're going to create in the world, and this is esoteric, you've got to be able to match those energies. And that means I'm on the nightclub door. I've been in a situation. It's been very violent. It's very bloody. People are in hospital. Suddenly I'm in a room with the manager, the other doorman, tiny room, and senior policeman, and they're watching a video of me hitting people, and they freeze the video and say to me, you're using a knuckle duster. And they've got a freeze frame of me whacking people. And I feel like 10,000 volts of terror rush at me. Like, you know, because my liberty now is at stake. I'm going to, you know, that's the Section 18 wounding with intent. I'm going to go to prison, anything from 5 years up to life if one of them dies. I had to stay in the center. I had to stay in the center of those two forces, not for 5 minutes, Jack, for 3 months. 3 months I've got the threat all night in the police station with them persecuting me, trying to get me to admit that I'd used a knuckle duster against these, you know, these maniacs out just to rush the door. We're outnumbered by about 3 to 1, and they were like, oh, they were soldiers. And I've got to stay in that center. I've got to stay in that center until all of those negative energies and the positive energy just become one. And eventually that's what happens. But man, I developed a strong center, an isthmus from that. I became an isthmus. So when I was working the door, I had to be in that place all the time. You could never fall out of it. I had 4 friends who fell out of it and they all died. All of them were murdered on the doors or around the door. So, you know, associated with what we did. You could not fall out of that center. That meant being sober. That meant being vigilant. That meant as much as you could keeping morality on your side. I failed at that often. And developing a center that could hold you in the middle of all of those conflicting forces, and you're still creating them into light. So when I wrote about it, that's what I started to write about. So what I learned on the nightclub door was what the monks learned, you know, in deep meditation, you know, in the deserts and in the, you know, in the caves. you know, if you read any of the stuff about Mount Athamos and places like that, this is the stuff they learned, you know. So you go into it and you go, God, this is, you know, you think about provocation, and you think about, you know, when negative thoughts provoke you, and you engage them, you identify with them, and suddenly there's an enforced abduction of the will. Suddenly you're not thinking about anger, you are anger. Suddenly you're not contemplating or thinking about lust, you are lust, and then it's acting as you in the world. No different to being on the door, you know, no different. If you fell out of center and listened to the whispers on the door, and I saw this happen a lot, you would lose the eye wall and you would fall into the storm, and then you're gone, you're lost. That's the equivalent of Jung saying that if the dark forces come up to be individuated, to be processed into conscious knowing, and you don't recognize it, and they catch hold of you, they will drag you down into the unconscious. And that's, as we know, that's where psychosis lives. That's where schizophrenia lives. That's where lots and lots of mental health problems live, exactly the same. But exactly the same if you read in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It said, look, in the bardo, in that isthmus between lives, you will be approached by deities and demons, and they will try to seduce you, and they will try to threaten you and attack you. And if you engage them or identify with them, if you don't recognize that they are products of your own karma and your own imagination, they will suck you into a new reality of that kind. That's exactly the same as working the doors. Because of course, if you read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it will tell you that the bardo, the purgatory, isn't just after death, it's within this life. It's when you're born, it's when you exist. It's every moment we make a decision is a bardo moment, isn't it?
Mm.
You're out and you're having a drink, you've had one too many, you're happily married, you've got kids, they're beautiful kids, got a great life, and suddenly you're an attractive guy, Jack, one of the girls or whatever starts to hit on you, and that's a bardo moment. If you go with it, that may possibly ruin your life, even if your wife doesn't find out. The conscience tortures you. How often do we have those moments of saying the wrong thing in a bardo moment, thinking the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, and then often we see catastrophic consequences that we can't reverse. So what I'm learning now and what I'm teaching now is basically just the same as what I learned on the door. You know.
Yeah, and I love the matching between
you
know what you're doing on the door in a nightclub in Coventry and what the Desert Fathers are doing in northern Egypt or in Tibetan monks in the Himalayan hills.
It's exactly the same.
Yeah, but when you were there, you know, you're mentioning all these texts and writers. Were you reading this sort of stuff?
No, I was led to all that. I was led to that much later.
Right. So where were some of not that you were sort of consciously, not that you would have been able to say what you're saying now back then, but what was sort of some of the influences on you during that time that were helping you sort of piece that world together in your mind?
Yeah, well, I was already looking at people like Funakosi and people like Ueshiba, and people like Kanazawa who went very spiritual, particularly Ueshiba, the founder of Aikido.
Yeah, so they're all sort of martial arts experts that saw it as a spiritual methodology as well.
They very much went through the physical, same as I did, but they went into the Buddha end, the esoteric end. So if you look at Ueshiba, for instance, his whole martial art his higher martial art comes from Chinese mythology. So what we would call an isthmus, he would call the floating bridge of heaven and hell. So he would say you have to create a floating bridge. That's where the chi comes from. That's where our power comes from. And he said when you create a floating bridge, he said you are rained on by attractive forces. He was basically talking about the same thing. Wisdom, knowledge comes when you place yourself between those two forces. So I was really starting to get attracted to all my influences at the time were in the martial arts. Most of them were not terrestrial influences. I had a lot of terrestrial influences, you know, like what I mean by that, by living influences in the martial arts, the physical martial arts. But once I became a doorman, that wasn't relevant to me anymore, because I knew the truth. I knew what worked, and I was doing it every night, and I was teaching it, and I was certain. There was an absolute certainty. So I wasn't looking for other teachers who could teach me, you know, physical efficacy. I knew what that was. I was looking for teachers that could show me how to go beyond that. Not to be physically capable in a fight, but to be able to center myself so that there are no fights. I'm not in a fight. So Ueshiba would say, you know, when someone said to him, "Are you not afraid as a famous martial artist being challenged?" He said, "No, because the moment they approach me, they would realize they're taking on the whole universe." So he would say they would fall over before they reach me. They would realize the futility of it. Not because I'm going to batter them, but because they realized they would walk into truth. So I was really interested in that, and I couldn't find anybody terrestrially. So I was led towards ancient martial artists, people, you know, supernatural martial artists, people that were no longer physically in a body. So I started to study people like Ueshiba, and I was really interested in, you know, these guys. And then that kind of led me naturally towards people like Gurdjieff, you know, some of the real pragmatists. You know, he was a mystic in the, I think, the 18th, 19th century. But he was very, very pragmatic. He was kind of like, "Are you doing the work?" The bottom line is, are you suffering?
Yeah.
You know, you can talk about this intellectually all day long, but are you getting up and are you suffering? Are you going into the work? Are you doing the work? So I was really interested in people like that. So because I was starting to develop, and because I was consciously suffering, I started to attract teachers that guided me with that, and they all came through books. Initially, it would be like, maybe it would be Waterstone's Front of Shelf, and then it led, which is kind of entry-level books, then it would lead to the more esoteric books.
Get further and further down the bookshop.
More and more subtle, yeah, until the bookshop doesn't accommodate you, and then you end up somewhere like Watkins.
Yeah.
And all of this is led intuitively. So you've got an inner tutor, an inner guide. It's not somebody necessarily saying, "Read this" or "read that." It's an inner tutor leading you onto a thread that you follow, and you feel it intuitively. I'll buy that book. I'll read that book. So then it led on to, you know, the Bibles, because I was looking at some of the teachers and I was thinking, "Oh, this guy is really good, but, you know, where's it come from? Where's that come from?" And everybody I studied always led back to the same place. It led back to the Bible, one of the Bibles, you know, the Gita or the Christian Bible or the Quran or whatever it was, you know. So I started to go, well, I'll go to the source. And then once I got to the source and I started to study the bigger books, I automatically started to be given the esoteric. That was the grace I received for sitting down and reading full time. And I would also attract teachers. Someone would hear I'd read the Srimad Bhagavatam, a guru, and invite me around to his house. And then he would read me like I'm, you know, like I'm an X-ray, and tell me 2 things that I need to do. I don't even know this guy, but he knows that I'm doing the work because I've read this book. I've read this. The Srimad Bhagavatam is like 15 volumes. They're massive. So he knows I've studied it. So he introduces me to a temple in London and puts me with other teachers. So all this starts to happen because I'm doing the work. To sit down and read something full time that you don't understand, you know, because you read something like the Bhagavatam or the Zohar and you don't understand it, but you're not meant to. The soul reads it as a barcode, but you've got to completely demolish the ego. The ego is going to go, "Don't understand it, it's uncomfortable." And it's because it goes in like an antibody. The words you read in something like the Zohar go in like an antibody and start cleaning you out. So it creates a tremendous explosion in you that makes you want to put it down and run away from it and just go, "I don't understand it." But again, you have to sit in the isthmus in the center and look at that. Look at those voices that rise up. Sit in those voices. Don't do anything with them. Just let them become individuated. And when they become individuated, they're no longer shadow, they're no longer fearful voices. So I was led completely intuitively. I initially tried to find some terrestrial teachers, but I wasn't able to. And I was led towards the non-terrestrial teachers. But again, eventually you realize that there's not really any difference, you know, dead or alive. There's not really much difference. There's just the teachings coming in a way that's best for you to receive.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, going back to that sort of grace idea that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
There's that sort of coming. And so you've now taken on this sort of role as, I suppose, more of a spiritual teacher than the martial arts teacher that you were.
Yeah.
What are sort of the current or recurrent issues that you see people continuing to come to you with?
You know, everything. The people come to me with everything from you know, agony aunt stuff to, you know, deep esoteric questions. But the answer is always the self, or the answer is always the same. It's directing them to the self. So I don't know the answers to their problems. Like, you could come to me, and if you asked me to look, I could tell you what you needed to work on. I could see, and by listening to you, I would know. But I would say I'm not really the best teacher for you. The best teacher is your own inner tutor, but I know how to get to that inner tutor, and you can do that through meditations and, you know, by contracting. So we start to, you can say, like, you know, if you want to, especially if they're starting to talk metaphysical stuff, you want to do metaphysical things, but you're still struggling with mundane things. You want to do the impossible, but you're struggling with the necessary. So I would get them to build up and say, do the necessary first. Don't come to me 5 stone overweight and say you want to learn, you know, metaphysical meditation. You're not ready for that yet. You know, it would be like saying, like a light bulb saying, I'm only 100 watts, but I want you to give me 1,000. You would blow it. So we are protected. We are protected with short circuits to stop that from happening. So I'd say, look, if you're really serious about this, at the moment you aren't unified. There's one part of you wants to do this, but there's 10 parts of you that don't. And the one part I can see straight away is the part of you that's still addicted to sexual pornography, the part of you that's still in the world, still politicking, the part of you that still can't control what you eat, part of you that's still gossiping, have no control of yourself. So first of all, win your territories back. And as you win the territories back, your inner tutor will wake up. Your inner tutor will wake up and help you. And it will say, okay, we haven't got enough information. We need to read these books in order to expand the intellect. We haven't got enough will force. So we need to do these disciplines to have the will force to deal with this. You know, so it will give you specific bespoke instruction. So my initial thing would be to say, get your palate right first. Let's start with that. Let's get the necessary right first. And if you don't understand why you need to get your palate right, then that becomes the study. And if you can't make yourself sit down and study, then you haven't got a will force. And if you haven't got a will force, you're not in a position to do anything metaphysical. First of all, you get your will force being able to control the necessary things. And then the possible. So you do all of the possible, all of it. And you go, believe me, once you start doing all of the possible, you don't have to ask for instruction. Instruction will drop onto your mat. It will drop in like divine email. But so the main thing is that I'm seeing that people want the magical, but they don't want to deal with the mundane. An example from the door. One of my students said to me, I'm going to be a bouncer. He said, I've mastered fear, and I'll never be afraid again, and I want to be a doorman. I said, how would you feel if you work in the first night and you know, you get a phone call at 4 a.m. because you've upset somebody, and you get a voice on the phone that says, I'm going to murder you, I'm going to shoot you, and I'm going to find out where you live, I'm going to shoot your wife, I'm going to shoot your kids. I said, and he means it. I said, how do you feel about that? He goes, I don't want that in my life. I said, then don't be a doorman. The moment he said he'd mastered fear, I knew he'd lost. Because the moment you think you've got it, you haven't got it. So it's the same with the metaphysical stuff. Don't go into it you know, thinking that it's you know, that it's a Sunday stroll with with a meal at the pub. It's not. It's very deeply serious stuff to do. You have to dedicate your life to it, and you have to grow into it gradually. This is I'm just telling you from my own experience. So I say to people, get those things mastered right. I know that most men I meet are struggling with sexual pornography. They're struggling with overeating. They're struggling with desperately wanting to make money, and the two don't go together. The idea of becoming spiritual and making lots of money don't sit very well together. They're not good, but not very good bedfellows. It is part of the journey, and it might be part of your dharma to deal with money, but there's always going to be a conflict between the two. So they're still obsessed with the world, but they want to go into this magical realm. So I just say you need to build yourself up to that, and you need to be ready for that. You know, it's Gurdjieff spoke to me, I don't know, 15 years ago when I thought I was doing well, and I read Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson. I was on a cruise and I nearly threw it overboard. It was so deliberately complex. The way he writes deliberate is a deliberate shock to the ego. And the book, I read all the book because I'm very disciplined, but it wasn't till the end, the very end, which is often the way, where he just tapped me out. He says, "Oh, man of the world." He says, "You think you're doing well, you think you're smart, you think you're right, you think you've got it." He says, "But the first phone call that comes in and criticizes you, you're falling apart like a cheap suit. The first praise, the first, skirt flutter of praise, and you're high for the rest of the day. You're still controlled by what other people think and what other people say." And I remember feeling so angry because it was so true. I thought, I'm nowhere. I've got nowhere. So I started to really study people like Gurdjieff and see what it was he was looking at and what it was he was talking about. And they all come to the same thing. It's about developing an isthmus or becoming an isthmus, being able to sit in the center and being able to create from there, and then being able to take instruction from your higher self, even if you don't understand what that instruction means or where it's going to go. There'll be a feeling. Send this person a book. Do that interview. Don't do that interview. There'll be definite instructions that you follow. You have to have a good partner. So I say to my wife, send this box of books to this person. She doesn't say to me why. She just says, what's the address? And because I don't know why. I only know that it needs to be there. And I send it, and then I don't think about it again. I don't put it down. I don't give myself a credit. I just do what I'm called to do. And that's when I open myself up to this. If you practice the kind of habitual virtues, you start opening yourself up to these infused virtues, and they happen when you need them. And when they do happen, I had one happen 3 years ago, and it's still unfolding now. I had an incident that lasted probably 15 minutes, an encounter that probably lasted 15 seconds, and it's opened with the concept nucleus that so far has opened up 650,000 words of writing that's come from it. Now you've got to have the discipline to be able to sit down. I don't know where the fuck it's going. I don't know. I only know that most of the stuff that's coming I never knew before, and it's beautiful, but it's not mine, and it's coming through me and it's coaching me, but I don't know where it's going to go. And it took me a long time to stop struggling with that. Just said, let it go, just write it. And you have to really trust that, and you have to trust that it will go where it needs to go. So it's another level of living. You're not living in the normal world anymore. You're not living around normal people anymore. You can't really have very many conversations with normal people anymore. And again, I don't mean that in a patronizing way. It's just that you're not going to be sitting there slagging off a politician or talking about what one of the neighbours has done or getting upset by stuff. You're just not going to go there. You're not going to fall into any of the isms or the phobias. You're not going to go there with any of that, because it's none of your business. You're just there to work on what you've been commanded to work on. That doesn't make you great company.
Is there a selfishness to that?
Yeah, I would call it proper selfishness. What Charles Handy would call proper selfishness. It's selfish because it's bespoke, and there's only one person you need to please, and that is God. So that's besides your wife and everybody else. Everything has to come second. But it's a selfishness that will expand your consciousness. And whether people know it or not, or whether they acknowledge it or not, it doesn't matter. When you expand your consciousness, even if you just go up by 1 grade, that will advance the consciousness of everybody on the planet. Your consciousness changing will change the consciousness of everyone. Same as if you change your consciousness and become dark, that will affect what you think and say and do, will affect everything and everybody. Everybody contributes to the fatberg of karma that's going on in the world. Everybody's responsible for what's going on in all the wars in the world. Whether we contribute with a bit of malicious gossip or whether we participate with a murder, in a sense, it doesn't really matter because it's all adding to the fatberg. So we can change that by chipping away at the fatberg, by doing kind things every day.
And in that way, it's totally not selfish.
It's non-selfish, yeah. So it's proper selfish because it's like you're doing just what you've been commanded to do, but it's not selfish in the old-fashioned sense, because I don't care. I'm not looking for anything from it, but I want to please God. I want to do what pleases God. And if you ask me to articulate God, I can't, but I can. I know how it feels to please Him. I know if you read someone like Thomas Merton, we did a beautiful statement where he said, "I don't know where I'm going." This is one of the highest level mystics, of the last generation. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not even sure whether what I'm doing is right. I only trust that what I'm doing is pleasing you. That's all I'm interested in. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know where I'm going. And he was comfortable with that. So we can't really know, but we can discern direction by the fact that it's pleasing him, and we'll know that by what we feel in us. But it's not about accolades. It's not about followers. It's not about making money. It's not about people liking you or disliking you. So in a sense, it's completely non-selfish, because there's no self to be selfish. You see what I'm saying? But it's about proper selfishness, in that you, as far as the world is concerned, you're just doing what you want to do. You're just doing your own thing. And that's what I do. I've condensed my whole life so I can just sit and do this every day, write, study. And that's the commandment I received very clearly as a voice. And it's been difficult because I was always selfish. I was always quite narcissistic. I was always quite greedy. I had a good heart and I was a good person, but I had deep problems with insecurity. Definitely constantly wanted to be validated, and that what God's guided me to do is not to get rid of those, but to observe them with what you would call the Moses look, observe them without identification and without engagement, and convert them into light. So my consciousness expands, not despite all of those faults, but because of it. So that is what you would call repentance, or returning, or repairing, or finding refuge in oneness. So we're going from duality to an absolute state. That's the game. That's and if I'm being honest, I fail at it most days. I trip over, but I'm learning to trip less, and I'm learning to get up quicker.
Yeah, well, it's a constant work in progress.
Yeah, but I love it, and it's I feel the same with this work as I did with the door. Don't do it if you're not serious. Don't flirt with it. You can't flirt with it, because it's very hard to explain, but it can be absolutely overwhelming, especially when you get a shock, like a divine shock. When you go up an octave, sometimes you need a bit more energy and you get a divine shock, and suddenly your body is filled with an exponential amount of anxiety. And you've got to be able to sit in the middle of that and recognize it just as an energy. You've got to go to a place of denotation. It's just energy. And you go, where does he want me to put it? Boom. Put it into a book, put it into a film, put it into a talk. Now, if I don't do something with that, I will implode. And I'll then probably end up at the doctor trying to get, something to calm it down, or or if I told them some of the thoughts or some of the visions I've had, I'd probably be getting a checkup from the neck up, one of those kind of things, with my new jacket, one of those jackets. So you have to be able to go, because your body, your ancient body, your thousand, you know, we've got thousands of years of conditioning in us that's going to go. It's anxiety. You've got to run. You've got to get rid of it. You've got to stop it. You've got to escape it. Everybody wants to escape the daily current, don't they? But this is about going, this is just energy, and this is a gift, and it wants me to put it into that. And I may have to sit with it for the next 3 months. It may not go away entirely. And I've got to be able to sit in there every single day, even though part of me feels like I'm tipping, feel like I'm losing my mind, you know, feel like I can't cope with it. But I go back to the door. The door is my grounding. Got people trying to kill me, and I have to stay in the center. And it's even worse because I'm not the best fighter in the city, not even the best fighter in the club. But I'm sober and I train. So I've got the advantage over most people, because most of them aren't training regular, even though they're ferocious, and most of them are not sober. So I've got an advantage over most people because of that. So I can compensate for the fact that I'm not the best, but and I don't mean sober just in the sense of drink. I mean, I'm sober, I'm awake, I'm aware of their vulnerabilities, I'm aware of my own fears, I know how to control that, I know how to hold my voice in the middle of that. So I'm back on the door again, really, Jack. It's this very similar kind of scenario. And I'm stunned when I look back at my book, Dead or Alive, and it's a book about physical self-protection. It could have been written by a desert father. When you read, you know, some of that ancient work, you go, God, this is just like a martial arts book, but it's internal. You know, it's the same thing, but it's internal. Well, it's all internal anyway, isn't it? Even on the door, all of it happens inside of you. That's what Gurdjieff talks about, self-remembering. Remember, it's all happening in you. So that's what you need to fix.
Yeah, that's where the work happens. Yeah. Well, Geoff, that I could think of a few better ways to spend the early hours of the morning, having a wonderful, deep, and beautiful conversation with yourself. So, and I think, you know, with the words that you've said about focusing on yourself, I think that's probably a good place to sort of wrap things up and leave people with that thought. But
just remember, the world is a distraction. It's constantly distracting you from working on yourself. It gives you problems you can't solve, but you can solve the problems in you, and maybe you'll be directed to work in the world as well. Maybe that's part of it, but you know, you can't fix the world, you know, with a broken tool.
Well, I think it's in your introduction to one of your more recent books, The Divine CEO, where you say you won't find freedom in the world because it does not exist.
Yeah.
And I think that's getting pretty close to the nub of the matter.
Yeah.
But yes, Geoff, thank you very much for coming on. I'll put links to as many of your books as I can, because there are so many of them. And I'll make sure in the introduction that I tell people about all of them and where they can find more of your work. Because we really have sort of skimmed over a lot of your life, a lot of your story. So there's plenty more out there for people to be able to dig into and find.
For people, isn't it? If something triggers somebody, inspires them, or gives them something, then it might lead them towards a book. Then they can sit with the book, and the book will always lead them to other places. That's the whole idea of the quantum area of this work, is that you go into a book and it will lead you exactly where you personally need to work to go. Not, you know, like it would lead Jack Fernan or Geoff Thompson or whoever reads it. It's not a general direction. It's very directional. It's not incandescent, in other words. It's not going to send you everywhere. It's going to send you in a specific place just for you. And if you've got the discipline to follow that, then the growth will be exponential.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Geoff. Yes, as I said, there's plenty more of your work out there that people can access. But it's been a real pleasure and honor talking with you. And I look forward to keeping in touch in the future.
Thanks, Jack.
And thank you everyone for joining.